Good afternoon, you all. I want to say thank you to Ben and also Susan for having me here. It's been an exciting morning, right? I wish I had Bodhi's text, I told him, because he speaks very fast, but it was so great. And also Anastasia's lecture was so brilliant. Well, Bodhi's talk was, I think, a philosophical, conceptual one, whereas Anastasia's, well, she talked about one of the most important conflicts in the world. It's not exactly my case. Brazil is a sort of isolated country. Is very irrelevant globally, in my opinion. You don't think so? We could be a very important leadership in climatic problems and solutions in the contemporary world, but Brazil can never solve his own problems. And I think the one thing for which we've been known for the last century, it's a social technology that developed in Brazil spontaneously, unofficially, despite the official projects of the elites. And it's the one thing that we are kind of throwing away. So that's my subject here. I hope it can interest you, okay? I'm going to read a text about 30 minutes, I think, and then we can discuss it. Let me see if it gets better with glasses. Yeah, it does. So, we find ourselves at a cultural crossroads in Brazil, grappling with the question of what to do with a certain idea of Brazilianness. An idea that inspired a significant civilizational project, yet one that was never fully realized. This project, rooted in the character of Brazilian miscegenation and mestiçagem, a term I will probably return to, emerged organically over centuries, long before it became a conscious endeavor. It reached the peak of self-awareness in Brazilian society during the mid-20th century, but has since entered a profound crisis in the 21st century. While there are many valid and compelling reasons for this crisis, I argue that there are also equally valid reasons to defend this project, not so much for what it has achieved, but for what it could still achieve, provided we address the criticisms that have been leveled against it. Well, the central question then is this: what will we do with the issue of miscegenation and mestiçagem in Brazil? Miscegenation refers to the biological process of mixing, whereas mestiçagem also encompasses the cultural dimension of this mixture. It is noteworthy that the term mestiçagem does not have a direct equivalent in English. It is often translated as half-breed, I think, which remains confined to the biological level. And this linguistic gap reflects the different historical trajectories of Brazil and the United States. To summarize it very radically, despite centuries of biological and cultural mixing and constitutional progress toward universalist ideals, many of these constitutional rights remained nominal rather than effective. Brazil had no policy that attempted to integrate black people after the abolition of slavery. We were one of the latest countries in the whole world to abolish slavery. Nor did we ever experience a movement comparable to the civil rights movement in the United States. But on the other hand, we experienced centuries of extensive miscegenation among Europeans, mostly Portuguese, but also French and Dutch in the first centuries of European colonization, Africans and indigenous peoples during the colonial period, followed by further mixing with Japanese, Lebanese, as in my case, Germans, Italians, and other immigrant groups from the 19th century onward. While Brazil did have social racism and some racist policies, our history is quite different from that of the United States, from the plantation rules to racist ideology and its effects on miscegenation. And of course, we never implemented a system as rigid as the Jim Crow laws in the United States. These differences help to explain why American ideas of decolonization cannot be directly applied to the Brazilian context. And the decolonization discourse in contemporary Brazil comes mostly from the United States, maybe critical theory of race above all. I was talking to Bodhi that Walter Miolo, for example, is not very well known in Brazil. So, this is the central argument I aim to develop today. Of course, during the 1990s, there were some important authors, such as Rony Cababa and Paul Gilroy, and many other Brazilian intellectuals and artists, whose ideas, so I think, are much more appropriate to understand Brazilian history and design its future. But these ideas were defeated, at least for now. And maybe we should discuss the reasons of this defeat after I finish this reading. Anyway, in contemporary Brazil, post-colonial and decolonial discourse often takes the form of national self-delegitimization, seeking to transform the country into a multicultural or even a tribalist society by separating black and white cultures, a move that contradicts both biological and cultural evidence of Brazil's deeply mixed reality, its hybridization, as we could say, quoting Baba, although Baba thinks a lot about cultural resistance of the oppressed, which is right, of course. Nonetheless, I think we should give more space to free and creative bilateral exchanges, as in the case of Brazil. At this point, it is important to note that basically everything I discuss about racial issues here concerning black, mestiços, and white people in Brazil cannot be extended to indigenous peoples in Brazil. This is due to profound differences in the history of black and indigenous peoples in Brazil. These last have never become fully integrated to Brazilian culture, although, of course, they contributed a lot to it. Their population decreased dramatically during the colonial period until very recently, a couple of decades ago, when it started to increase again. Throughout this history, they kept their culture and fought to maintain their territories, which are essential to their way of living. My point thus is as follows. Black people in Brazil have turned to be Brazilians, despite racism and all the social and economic injustice they have suffered and still suffer. There has been deep cultural hybridization, which allows us to speak of a common reality, a common people. But the same cannot be said about indigenous people. In their case, I lean to the defense of a plurinational state, as it is in Bolivia, for example. This is just a parenthesis. Now, let us get back on track. So, we must go back to the beginning, or rather, before the beginning. Although Brazil was officially a project of European capitalism during its expansion in the 15th and 16th centuries, it began to take shape spontaneously before Portugal established the hereditary captaincies, which were mega latifundio, and implemented a slave-based production system and defined its extractivist civilizational project. At least 30 years prior to these official developments, Brazil began to form unofficially through the interactions of shipwrecked Portuguese, with indigenous communities. These early interactions were facilitated by cunhadismo, which is an indigenous social practice that integrated foreigners into the community through kinship ties. The first generation of mixed-race individuals, known in the colonial period as mamelucos, which is the mixture of European Portuguese and indigenous people, emerged from these relationships, creating a uniquely Brazilian biotype that was neither Europe nor indigenous. This original scene of cultural and biological mixing predates the more exploitative mode of miscegenation that would later dominate Brazilian history, the relations of absolute power between masters and slaves. Thus, Brazil's history is marked by two simultaneous and opposing processes. On one hand, there was the official Brazil, a peripheral enterprise of expanding European capitalism, built on the enslavement of indigenous people and later Africans. On the other hand, there was the unofficial Brazil, formed through free and forced interactions among diverse populations, which gave rise to uniquely Brazilian culture. Now, the official Brazil, characterized by its violent and hierarchical colonial origins, underwent a series of modernizations that never truly broke with its oppressive past. This process, often referred to as conservative modernization, has been a recurrent theme in Brazilian historiography. Despite numerous institutional milestones, Brazil has never achieved a unifying national idea. So what came closest to fulfilling this role was Brazilian popular culture, which emerged from the exchanges among diverse groups under conditions of both oppression and limited freedom. There's an important debate here. Obviously, we did not have in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries censuses as we know them today. But we do have, if not proper studies, some demographic information about the colonial period. And what it shows is that the European white population in positions of power was a very, very small minority, about 5%, if so. I tend to agree with these historians and demographers who have the perspective that it would be a mistake to approach the Brazilian miscegenation experience exclusively or even mainly from the model of the relationship between masters and slaves. This is not entirely true about the colonial period, and it's certainly false about the last 150 years. But this casts a curse on Brazilian miscegenation. Thus, during colonial Brazil, and later in imperial Brazil, up to the end of the 19th century, a set of cultural mixtures was formed in the territory that were no longer European and no longer properly Amerindian and nor African. So what were they? They were Brazilian. There are millions of examples of this. One particularly interesting is that of our language. What we recognize today as Portuguese is a very complex product of a colonizing language itself mixed. Latin, as you might know, is a mixture of languages from various people. And when the Portuguese invaded Brazil, try to picture the scene. A handful of Portuguese speakers dealing with a much larger contingent of indigenous people in their own territory. The Africans enslaved were subjected to a policy of ethnic segregation. They avoided, for example, placing many Bantus in the same place, many Yorubas in the same place, so that they could not maintain their culture and so that they could remove any associative political capacity. Thus, The enslaved came to Brazil and were stripped of everything. This is why, incidentally, the slave enterprise with Africans worked better from the obviously economic perspective of the owners, because the indigenous had territory, had the conditions to maintain a symbolic associative territorial resistance. The enslaved, the Africans enslaved, did not. They arrived in Brazil and had no way to speak their own languages and did not speak Portuguese, so they were almost entirely illiterate, so they did not learn quickly through writing. Thus, the colonizing language faced hard obstacles to impose itself. Who took this job upon themselves were the Jesuits. They created this mixture of Portuguese with indigenous languages, which came to give rise to Iengatu, and with other indigenous languages, which came to give rise to the so-called general languages. Brazil, from the 16th century until the mid-19th century, predominantly spoke Iengatu and the general languages. It was a minority in Brazil that spoke Portuguese. So even under conditions of extreme domination, the populations managed to some extent to impose their cultures in such a way that they mixed and produced symbolic goods that make up Brazilian culture. In the case of our language, the Portuguese we speak today is quite different from that of Portugal. And perhaps the most fundamental difference is the fact that Portuguese from Portugal has this very consonantal phonetic pattern. So it is difficult for us Brazilians. I remember the first time I went to Portugal, I didn't understand much because they kind of swallowed the vowels. As you Germans probably, it's kind of a harsh language. So in our phonetic pattern, the Brazilian phonetic pattern is the pattern of Tupi, the main indigenous family of languages, and various African languages, which is the consonant-vowel rhythm. These mixtures were repressed by the thin literate layer of colonial and imperial Brazil. I come from literature. So if we study the historical movements, the historical periods of literature up to the 18th century, it is a completely alienated literature, except for a writer or two. But in general, you read Arcadian poets and you swear you're anywhere in Europe, but not in Brazil. I swear there are snowy landscapes in Brazilian poets in the 18th century. The Brazilian cultural project began to unrepress the miscegenated reality progressively somewhere around the second part of the 19th century. The modernist movement of the early 20th century marked a turning point in the unrepression of Brazil's mixed cultural heritage. Modernist writers and artists sought to understand Brazil on its own terms, its own hybrid singularity. This movement laid the foundation for the acknowledgement of Brazilian popular music, which, alongside football, became a defining feature of Brazilian culture. Popular music, in particular, provided a space for the protagonism of black people and fostered a more democratic interaction among people of different racial and social backgrounds. So Brazilian popular culture is this dimension of our historical experience in which we managed to achieve everything that the Brazilian institutional project hardly ever even attempted to. It is in Brazilian popular culture that we have protagonism of black people. It is in popular music that we have a much more democratic relationship between whites, mulattoes or mestiços and blacks, poor, middle class and rich, university educated, semi-literate, illiterate. This from a sociological point of view, whereas from a semiological point of view, Brazilian popular music mixes the melodic and harmonic tradition of European tonal music with the countermetric characteristic of African rhythms. Thus, throughout colonial Brazil, imperial Brazil, and into the 20th century, we formed this extraordinary phenomenon that is Brazilian popular culture. And in the first half of the 20th century, this phenomenon was so strong, so vigorous, so evident, that it reached a level of self-awareness, and it became the self-image of the nation. However, Brazilian popular culture is not without its limitations. Recent critics, particularly from black movements, have highlighted issues such as the whitewashing of samba and other cultural forms. While these critics are valid, they do not diminish the significance of popular culture as a unifying force in Brazilian society. For much of the 20th century, popular culture served as the self-image of the nation, inspiring generations of artists and intellectuals who saw it as a model for social transformation. Well, every time we do historiography like this, historiography of complex objects, we can, of course, isolate a set of phenomena that all go into the same direction. But of course, at every historical moment, there is a dispute of narratives at stake. So there is a counter-history to this, which is the anti-miscegenation and anti-mestiço one. Its strongest part is the institutional history of Brazil itself. From slavery to the ambiguous actions of the Jesuits, all the segregationist, hierarchical, violent efforts in the institutional field. We often say that Brazil never had state racist policies, but that's not true. We did not have anything comparable to the Jim Crow system, but throughout our history, there were not one or two, but a series of racist initiatives by the Brazilian state, eugenic policies prohibiting the immigration of black people, and encouraging European immigration to turn the population whiter. The other counter-narrative is intellectual. I have described how popular culture formed, gained consciousness, and became the inspiration for a certain model. Now I will talk about how it entered into crisis. What is the reason for this crisis? It's the limitations of the cultural project. The tradition of the first so-called great interpreters of Brazil, both the modernists and the famous generation of sociologists and historians from the 1930s, were almost invariably from the upper classes. And what they have in common, and this characterizes their culturalism, that is, their perspective of understanding the history of Brazilian society through culture, is what a historian from University of São Paulo in the 70s called the relentless effort for unity. So these intellectuals are thinking about Brazil in terms of what would be the national sentiment, what would be a certain Brazilian way, a Brazilian culture. But meanwhile, in the 30s, another important phenomenon was happening in Brazil, which was the creation and development of University of São Paulo. Some important European intellectuals went there, like Lévi-Strauss himself, for example, Brodel also, Pierre Verger. So the University of São Paulo, as a public university, managed to form, less than 20 years later, a generation that no longer came from the same social place as the previous generations of interpreters of Brazil. And this generation radically changed the adventure of Brazilian thought. You see how, to jump ahead here using a contemporary category, the concept of standpoint view, which I myself find ambiguous. It has a very pertinent and important dimension, and another one which is dangerous and counterproductive. But in this important dimension, look how strongly it reveals itself. The first person to radically change the interpretation of Brazil in the 20th century concerning miscegenation and racial issues was a sociologist called Florestan Fernandes. He was the son of a domestic worker. His studies were paid for by his mother's employer. And the change in the place of speech changes the social interpretation of Brazil. This generation of Florestan, which writes during the 50s and 60s, in which he largely taught, began to critique the work of these previous interpreters of Brazil from a primarily Marxist repertoire. A repertoire that thought about the constitutive conflicts of Brazilian society through more concrete, materialistic categories. Through critics like this, a first generation in the theoretical field began to deconstruct the ideas that underpin the notion of a unifying popular culture. This begins the counter-history of the praise of popular culture. This counter-history has several chapters, each of them containing true and strong evidence and arguments. Its latest chapter, not so true and not so evident, is the identitarian movement, as we call it in Brazil. Because in Brazil, usually only conservatives use the word woke. Thus, I have finally reached the point I wanted to reach. The point where we are now, as far as I can see. Throughout the 20th century, we had a certain idea of what the Brazilian nation was, and this idea was certainly based on popular culture. This idea is now in crisis. And note, the person speaking here is not someone who considers the crisis of the self-image to be without reason. Quite the contrary, there are numerous compelling reasons for it. But again, the question is, what do we do now? I personally used to think, when the racialization of Brazilian life began, about 20 years ago, that it would be the necessary negative stage of a process. And I have no doubt that it was very successful in some respects. Critics of the limitations of culturalist universalism are in general correct. Basically, this universalism never reached the social, economic, and political stances, but superficially. The question I have been asking myself in recent years is, this contemporary movement, which works very well in its negative stage, should we affirm it as a positive stage in the construction of Brazil? Is it capable on its own terms of building a society? Well, it is clear at this point that this movement is disrupting social life in the sense of segregating people and stimulating racial hatred. Of course, black people have always been segregated and suffered social hatred. But now, segregation is seen not as a dangerous way to overcome itself, but as an acceptable, maybe desirable end. Tribalism is the very opposite of the Brazilian mestiço utopia, which is probably the one thing we used to be proud of as a nation. Until my last book, published in 2022, I defended a Sartrean dialectics regarding the identitarian movement. I refer to that moment when Sartre was talking to Fanon, to Césaire, to Senghor, during the anti-colonialist moment in the 1950s. Sartre wrote then a preface to an anthology of black poetry where he says the following. He considers that the racialist position in the racial debate, this anti-universalist movement, which seeks to solve racial conflict through more racial conflict, is a negative stage of a dialectical movement where the thesis would be, in the case of Brazil, culturalism, the pro-miscegenation project. The antithesis, or the negative stage, would be the movement that critiques this culturalist universalism from a perspective of separation. My position until very recently was that we should try to build a third stage, which would be something like an Aufhebung. There is a negation of the previous movement through the incorporation of it. So, in other words, my position in this debate has been the attempt to theoretically construct a new project that should remain faithful to mestiçagem, but incorporating some of the radical critiques made by contemporary minority movements. However, it's becoming every time clearer that the intellectual efforts, in the sense of clarify the discussion, separate identitarianism from minorities movements, and even from identity politics movements should be the first step. These efforts seem to be useless. No doubt, the resistance to identitarianism inside the left has globally improved, and the public debate is not as suffocating and intimidating as it was some 5 years ago. But the identitarians remain so. Right now, what we do have is the decolonizing theory trying to implement tribalism in a nation where almost 50% of its population identify as mestiços, whereas 10% identify as black. There is an ironic colonized aspect in the decolonizing movement in Brazil. Well, for starters, in Portuguese it should be called descolonização instead of decolonização. But the real problem is, we used to perceive ourselves as a miscegenated, mestiço society, and we, the left-wing part of society, had the dream of overcoming racism through the infinite shades of skin tones, for which we had many, many names. Caboclo, mameluco, cafuso, pardo, mulato, but also chocolate, marrom bombom, morena, moreninha. Now you gotta be Brazilian to understand these words. Now, this would lead to the paradox of singular races, which is another way to say race does not exist. Now, we adopted the American binary way, either black or white. I totally understand that to explicit conflicts is necessary to overcome them, but it is also a dangerous path, one in which means slowly become ends. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your very enlightening talk, and we already have a first question here in the But yeah, can you use a microphone because people online won't hear you otherwise.
Vizepräsident Deutsche UNESCO-Kommission. It was very interesting for me to listen to you, and because I had a very deep experience about 10 years ago in Brazil. That was a big festival on Cultura Viva, on the living culture of the different ethnic groups in Brazil. So black ones, or, indigenous, morenos, and so on. And the interesting point was that was a mise en scène of the ministry, which also invited me, because they wanted obviously to develop a Brazilian identity on the basis of these different cultural backgrounds. So it was less a westernization or decolonization. It was more a more conscious and positive view that we have an our own culture, and that culture is a multicultural. And on that basis, we have to build the identity of Brazil. That was my understanding. And I just wonder how you would see these things, because I mean, you are much more in it. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you for your commentary. You are absolutely right. You know, I was the president of the National Foundation of Arts and Culture during the government of the Labour Party, President Dilma Rousseff, and she was impeached in a very controversial process. So I was very close to these concepts and to this program, Cultura Viva. So what is important to note about that is that as a recent, modern and colonized country, the question and quest for national identity has ever been very important to Brazil. But there's a very interesting and politically affirmative aspect of this problem in Brazil, which is Brazilian identity has been perceived as a negative identity. Brazilian identity was perceived as incomplete, as diverse. I was talking again with Bodhi, who's there, about a famous Brazilian anthropologist, who is Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. He studies indigenous populations in Brazil, and indigenous people in Brazil, they have an ethical premise that is to see themselves as incomplete. You see, so this is very. This belongs very radically to national identity in Brazil, an identity that is negative, that is incomplete, that is open to the other. And this is precisely what is changing in Brazil. We could say that identitarianism, as we call it in Brazil, is a perspective that has somewhat as a fetish of identity, which is very difficult to be in favor for someone who comes from the psychoanalytical subject on the 20th century, which is incomplete, right? Identity for psychoanalysis is something that is never complete, and maybe the most dangerous temptation that one can have is to perceive its own identity as complete. This is the premise or the ideology which is in the basis of nationalisms, for instance. So right now, this is precisely what is happening in Brazil. Brazil kind of abandoned this negative identity in favor of, in the left-wing portion of society, in favor of this tribalist perspective, right? And of course, it has the best of the intentions, is to deepen democracy in Brazil, but its results have been the opposite, in my opinion. For instance, I was talking to Dominic the day before yesterday. The two most important public policies in favor of minorities in Brazil in the 21st century, they happened before the rise of the identitarian movement. One of them is the affirmative action for black people, black and indigenous people, in universities, in public universities. This changed Brazilian society. This radically changed Brazilian society. And this started happening on 2004, 2005. The other one is the law of gay marriage, which passed in the Supreme Court in 2013. So also before the identitarian movement, stricto sensu, emerged. From there on, we have had, in terms of public policies, just regressive movements. Again, identitarian movements were very successful to promote the agenda of acknowledgement, which is a very important one. But I think at the end of the day, the results are negative. That's my point of view. Thank you. Thank you.
Dominic Bonfilio.
I'm just trying to understand what it would mean in Brazil to impose a black or white categories on that society. I mean, when I think of like a term like BIPOC in the States, right? Like if you use a term like that in Brazil, I mean, theoretically, if you use it the way...
Which term, I'm sorry?
BIPOC. BIPOC.
BIPOC,
like
okay.
people of color, I always forget the first. People of color. But if you use a term like that, the way it's used in the United States, probably 95% of Brazilians could claim they were BIPOC, because the entrance price to be BIPOC, you don't have to be BIPOC through and through. I mean, it's sort of like 20, 30% would be enough to plausibly claim that you're BIPOC. But is there something like a reverse one-drop rule in Brazil that if you're just one teensy bit non-indigenous or non-black, that counts, that makes you white? What kind of logics are they using to break up the society in black and white?
Yeah, no, this is a tricky question. We used to perceive the nation through categories. These categories I presented, like white, mestiços, which in Brazil we call pardos. Pardos is like my color, for instance. It's kind of brown. Black people and indigenous people. Brazilian census, so the public policy, the official census, worked with these categories. Now, for the last decade, more or less, black movements, they managed to convince, to persuade a great part of society that pardos, mestiços, should identify as black. You see? And this has a huge impact on how Brazilians perceive themselves. Again, it's the abandonment of a certain self-image of a mixed society, right? In favor of this binary perception. And again, there are very compelling reasons for it. I think what happened in Brazil is the promises of liberal democracy, they were not fulfilled as we should expect. So there's a kind of desperation, to use a word that Anastasia used, in this regressive movements, which at least I perceive as a regressive. When I myself read cultural texts, globally speaking, as I said, from Homi Kababo, Paul Gilroy, or many of Brazilian thinkers, for me, they're much more adequate to perceive both Brazilian history and to design its future. But Brazilian society is drawing very much on American discourse, and I don't think it should be translated ipsis literis for Brazilian reality because of these reasons I presented here. So what we do have now is this dispute. On one hand, there is a right-wing nationalism, and these guys, they don't even think there's a Brazilian culture. They think Brazil is a Christian civilization, is a white Christian civilization. So all of this I told you here about samba, popular culture, these are not categories they work. This doesn't exist for them. And on the other hand, we have a split in the left between identitarians and a minority, which I belong to. It's important to say that I'm a minority ideologically speaking. If you went to Brazil, you wouldn't hear this discourse easily, right? But there's a minority trying to affirm this mestiço utopia by taking the criticisms, the important criticism, but not throwing away in the garbage this project. This is how I would resume the situation.
Der Herr im karierten Jackett, bitte.
Well, thank you very much for your very differentiating discourse and speech. I learned a lot about Brazil in this short time. I have a question. If I understood you right, then there is no need in Brazil for a sort of decolonization discourse, because Brazil suffices itself, with its own differences, search for identity, don't need an external foe, so to say, which was colonialism. Of course, in Latin America, colonialism is far more remote than in Africa, but my impression is we follow this discourse of decolonization and second decolonization now in the present world, but Brazil is not part of it.
I think that decolonization discourse in Brazil is misplaced. I think we do have the need of it, but it should emphasize the institutional aspects of Brazilian society. We surely have to decolonize Brazil, but mostly its institutions. We have to develop more public policies for minorities. There's no doubt about that. But decoloniality discourse in Brazil is all about culture, which is the only place in the only dimension of Brazilian experience where we don't need it. You see? So that's the problem.
Ben.
Thank you very much for that.
I'm sorry, Ben, and it's a little bit of an exaggeration to say we don't need in culture, but it's the place we need it less. We could do some adjustments, you see, but the main problem is an institutional one, and as the decolonization discourse is all about culture, what is happening in institutional politics is the very opposite. And there is a dynamics of interaction between one thing and the other. As the identitarians push into culture, the conservatives get more inflamed, so they react, and they react in institutional politics. So that's the problem. That's a dramatic problem in Brazil.
So I wanted to ask something about diversity, because in your description and also in my understanding, the question in Brazil is not that there isn't diversity or that there isn't acknowledged diversity, but diversity itself is so diverse that it can be taken for granted that things are diverse. And from then to move on to using something like diversity of a certain kind as a definition of national belonging, then raises an interesting question for me. What are the boundaries of the nation? Now, you already talked about the fact that in this kind of situation, the boundaries remain open. And if the boundaries of self-definition remain open, but you still have to act like a state, states don't like open boundaries. So is there a solution?
Yeah, well, first, I think there's a first question in your question, which has to do with diversity in Brazil as an ideology or a myth. There's a very famous sociologist in Brazil, which is Gilberto Freire. He was translated into French and into English. He studied with Franz Boas. He's a great writer and great sociologist. And he has this very important book on masters and slaves during the colonial period. So it's a very violent book. The book does not hide anything, but at the same time, it affirms at the end of the day the miscegenation of Brazilian people in the sense that it produced, through violence, it produced a unique people, right? So that's the point. So many people in Brazil read this book as if it was saying that Brazil was a racial democracy. I don't know if you know Stefan Zweig's book about Brazil. Zweig flew from Germany to Brazil during the persecution of the Jews, and he was marveled with Brazil because of the racial diversity. And again, it's not, of course, it's not that we didn't have and we don't have a racist ideology in Brazil. But it's very different in Brazil. Brazil is a country that where the concrete always defeats the abstract. This is a very important point in Brazil. So we had ideologies saying that white could not mingle with black, but it was useless. I mean, people mingled anyway. So the problem is the conservatives, consciously or not, have sustained this racial democracy myth over the centuries and mostly throughout the 20th century. So this is a very important point because this evident diversity of Brazilian people can function as a dissolving ideology. So that's why criticisms of what I called the culturalist universalism are so valid, right? But again, on the other hand, racial democracy is both a myth, but a myth is an ideology and at the same time a project, a dream of overcoming racial conflicts. So there's an ambiguity, there's an irreducible ambiguity, and the left in Brazil decided to solve this ambiguity in a certain way, which for me is the worst way possible, which is a tribalist way. Instead of fixing it where it should be fixed, which is the institutional dimension of Brazil. The other question about national borders, as a state, Brazil, of course, is not open. I don't know, how could I?
Okay, we have time for one more question, so Anastasia.
Thank you very much. I think you've picked up on something that's emerging as a sort of pattern, which is culture as the terrain of conflict, right? Whatever, you know, whatever culture means, whether it's books or music or sort of festivals, right? I mean, I laughed out loud when you said we don't need decolonizing our culture. Well, because as an anthropologist, Brazil has been a terrain of huge scholarly celebration of a very distinctive array of cultures, and the festival, even, you know, whether it's academic or popular imagery of Brazil, it's culture, you've got it, like you do it, that's not a problem. So I wouldn't be shy about it. I wouldn't say we need less decolonizing. You don't need to decolonize your culture, for God's sake, you just don't. But the really fundamental, I think, conceptual point here is that actually decolonization of the latter-day decolonization is actually a second phase of this kind of process, the first of which was actually real and serious, because it was when states were, after the Second World War, when states were becoming genuinely independent and they were decolonizing their institutions, they were creating governments, they were creating constitutions, institutions, and so on, right? Nobody really talked about culture, even though, you know, you would have thought they were creating nation states. Whereas now, you know, those nation states are there for some reason. It's culture that becomes the terrain at which, you know, this the supposedly liberatory movement is operating. And curiously, of course, that gets us back to what Ben boldly called right decolonialism, right? Is that what you said, Ben?
No.
Okay, the decolonial right, exactly. Is that the techniques and the terrain is absolutely identical to the operations of the American right, at least, and you know, we feel reverberations of that here in Britain quite strongly, and on the continent, I think, as well. But that has been the arrival in the political space from the 80s and increasing sort of influence of very much culture wars driven by you know, evangelical Christians for whom politics is about culture, it's about you know, ideals, about, you know, but that is really fundamental, that we're seeing that. And that, I think, supports very much the thesis that this is very much a movement to the right, even if it structurally occupies this, and in the political economy of it, it occupies the left, because nobody in academia would admit to being on the right.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Anastasia. Those very ideas of tribalism, for example, or nationalism, they used to belong to the right, but now they have become left-wing, yeah. But, you know, Brazilian independence was in the beginning of the 19th century. But Brazilian independence was, who proclaimed it, was the son of the emperor of Portugal. Then our abolitionist movement was a very radical one, and there were many authors who designed public policies to fully integrate the black people liberated to the Brazilian society after liberation from slavery, but it never happened. So there is this fundamental trauma in the history of Brazil. That we have never elaborated this trauma, so it's ever coming back as returning to real, as the psychoanalyst would say. I told here in the text that we have this recurrent theme in Brazilian history and sociology, which is the conservative modernization. So every important milestone in Brazilian institutional history is kind of a farce. You see? Every one of them is kind of a farce. So the real intention, we've never had a real bourgeois revolution or a liberal revolution or a democratic revolution. We're always having these ambiguous movements, these actually top-down movements by which the elites try to modernize itself and to prevent criticism from the most developed societies, but to modernize just enough so things can stay the same. Yeah, sounds perfect. So this fundamental trauma, it has to be solved. I don't think we need a revolution. I'm a reformer myself. But as a reformer, I think we do need a radical reform. You see? And we've never had something like a radical reform. The last time we attempted to have a radical reform was in the 60s. And it ended up in a military dictatorship. It's where everything happens to end in Brazil. And it almost happened again, so the last year, and it's not impossible to happen again in the next years. That's it.
Okay, I think now. Okay,
yeah.
Now we're getting into stuff that might be something for the coffee break.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
certainly. Yeah. But just because football is the dimension of Brazilian society where blacks have a protagonism.
Okay, we cannot do that. You have to use you have to use a microphone, please, because people cannot translate what you're saying and people online cannot hear you.
Yeah, but football can be on the coffee break. It's okay, so we can talk about it.
It's not so important. Yes, it is very important.
It's the most important thing.
Yeah.
But
I can say this because Susan is not here. She hates football, but football is the most important thing.
and you see the decline from Pelé to Neymar, yeah?
A decline?
From Pelé to Neymar. And Friedrichsreich has been expelled from the white-dominated team in the early 20th century.
Well, football is still a dimension in Brazilian experience.
You have to use a microphone, please.
Yeah. No, football is still an expression of Brazilian mixture and miscegenation. Again, and to finish, what we have to do is transform the society politically, economically, and socially in the same sense that football has invented itself, as popular culture has invented itself, instead of throwing popular culture in the garbage. That's the question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you also very much for a very vivid discussion, and please join me in thanking.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.